Hey everyone, my name is Daniel Lemon. I'm the owner of Special Magic Games. Thank you for having me here at GA Conference, and thank you to Ian Hamilton for inviting me to talk here. I am the solo developer of a PC game called Sequence Storm, which is a rhythm, racing, and adventure game. So today I'm going to talk about my game Sequence Storm. I'm going to talk about why I decided to focus on accessibility. I'll give an overview of all of the different accessibility features in it, including the blind accessibility features. And I want to try to answer some of your questions as well, because I reached out for questions on Twitter. Kyle, One Hand Mostly on Twitter, he asked, what challenges did you face when implementing accessibility, and how did you overcome it? So that's a pretty broad question, but hopefully throughout this entire talk I can answer it. So what is Sequence Storm? It's primarily a rhythm game, but it has elements of a racing game. I'm going to show you a short gameplay video so you can see what I'm talking about.
Amazing! Hey, what's the hurry?
So what we just looked at was a bunch of vehicles racing down a twisting racetrack in a virtual world that's called the Sequence. And the racetrack has symbols on it that correspond to the music that we were listening to, that was playing. So instead of steering a vehicle like a normal racing game, in this game the player is primarily pressing buttons in time with the music, in a typical rhythm game fashion. But in addition to the rhythm gameplay, there's some racing elements like boosting and drifting, and there's also a story campaign, but I'll talk a little more about the gameplay later. So how is this game relevant to GA Conference? It's because I've added a lot of accessibility options to the game, and I think this game is interesting to people in particular. Number one, it's a solo developed game, and number two, the game wasn't designed with all of these different features in mind. I got a couple questions on Twitter. Vivek asked, did you think about accessibility from the design process, or was accessibility implemented later on? And Benjamin asked, in what ways did designing for accessibility affect the overall design of the game, rather than just affect specific features? But really, when I designed this game at all, I didn't have any of these features in mind. So it's a case study in just adding features to a game, like after the fact. So why did I decide to focus on accessibility? There's a few reasons. Number one, I want to try to stand out from all the other indie games. There's so many. But also with my game, I felt like I had a unique opportunity, mostly because the gameplay in Sequence Storm is really linear. It's not like a platformer or adventure game where you're exploring a world. It's not really open-ended gameplay. It's really linear. So I felt that I had an edge, and that I could add something like the blind accessibility pretty easy. And also, I think the task of designing software that anyone can use, because a lot of people like to play games, but not everyone can. To me, that's just, as an engineer, I guess, that's an interesting problem to solve. So I'm really interested in doing that kind of work. So here's an overview of all the different accessibility features. Now, one thing my game had before I thought about accessibility was that the game can be played in a number of different ways. You can play with keyboard, gamepad, or arcade-style controllers that are made specifically for rhythm games. And the controls are totally remappable. Because one of my original goals was that I wanted people to be able to play however they wanted. And then I'm going to talk about more features. There's a little bit of a story about how I started getting into accessibility. I spend a lot of time watching people play the game. Like, if anybody has uploaded footage to YouTube or whatever, or streamed it on Twitch, I've watched as much of that as I can, because I want to see how people are getting on and if they're having any problems or issues. So I came across one player who was visually impaired, and he was able to play the game, but he had to get really close to the monitor. And so I talked to him, and we decided there's a couple features I could add to help. So this first one is a high contrast mode, which just dims everything that's not relevant. On the left we have a regular screenshot, and on the right the same scene, but with everything in the background is dimmed about 50%. And another option he helped me to add was this slower movement speed option. So on the left is a regular game, but on the right you can see elements are just a little bit closer to the player, which means that they're going to be moving slower as well. And this option doesn't actually slow down the game, it just kind of squishes everything closer to the player, so it's just a little bit easier to see, especially when things are moving really fast. So after those few features, I started to get more interested in accessibility, and I found the guidelines at gameaccessibilityguidelines.com. So I started to think about, of all those different features, what could I implement? So Sequence Storm has a high learning curve, and that was one of the original designs as well. I wanted it to be a little more complicated to play and learn. It has a lot of different controls involved in the rhythm gameplay. The screenshot on the left is a little bit small here, but all the controls are labeled. The game uses, on a gamepad anyway, both thumbsticks you tap back and forth. It uses both triggers, both shoulder buttons and the A button. So a total of 9 controls for the rhythm gameplay, and then some of the racing gameplay is done with the B button. So that's 10 buttons in total. So this fewer rhythm controls button reduces it from 9 down to 4. So on a gamepad, by default, it's just the 2 trigger buttons and the 2 shoulder buttons. And then, so the entire game with this option can be played with just 5 buttons. This really reduces the learning curve, the high learning curve, down to something that's a lot more casual and fun. I've seen a lot of people like review the game and say like, well, there's so many controls that come up and they're just not used to that level of complexity. So this option makes the game a lot more playable for those players. Also for kids, you know, if you just can hand it to them and they can just play. But yeah, so the game has a much wider audience just because of this one feature. And there's a bunch of options that customize the rhythm gameplay. So there's an option called No Simultaneous Notes, which means that you'll never have to press more than one button at a time. There's a Reduce Note Frequency option, which removes any like tightly packed together notes just to give you more time in between key presses. And there's a Generous Timing mode. I found that in developing a rhythm game, there's a lot of people who have a lot of trouble pressing a button on in time with the music, and so for some people, they're just never going to get it, it seemed. And so even with 3 timing difficulties that the game already had, it wasn't quite enough. So this option, Generous Timing Mode, by default, you have about 300 millisecond window in order to hit a note, but this option increases that to almost a full second. So it really alleviates the timing requirement, and also, just like the last slide, this option opens up the game to a lot more players that just wouldn't be able to play the game as it was. And you can also adjust the game speed anywhere from 50% all the way up to 200% if you want. So I'm going to show you a video of the very last mission of the game with all of the options that we talked about enabled, and also slowed down to 50%. So let's see how the game looks. So that's pretty easy. I have some stuff to say about difficulty. But to contrast that, let's look at what the game looks like if you play on the highest difficulty and you don't use any of those options. Here's like what that same mission looks like. So it's quite a big difference. So you can really customize the difficulty of the game however you want. And I'm not bothered by anybody using any of these options just to make the game easier. I mean, that's what they're there for. So if you want to just, I guess, cheat, I guess, to get all the achievements, I really don't care. The only thing that is really affected is on the Steam version of the game has leaderboards. So the way I handled that is that every single option that makes the game easier just applies a penalty to your leaderboard score. So anybody can upload, scores to the leaderboards regardless of, what options they need to use. So I got a couple questions about kind of my workflows to developing features and testing. Access Bridge asked, how did you go about recruiting disabled users for testing? I think a lot of folks would find that info both helpful and actionable. I don't really feel like I actually actively recruited anybody. I just kind of put it out there and looked for interest. Antonio asked, how did you decide the order to implement them? Time of request, difficulty to code? What did you learn from this experience, and what advice would you give to other devs? So I really, easiest stuff first, obviously, and a lot of that stuff wasn't too hard. And when I first added a lot of the accessibility features, the beginning ones, that really encouraged me to go on and add more, and then it made me really realize it would be worth it to try to add, like the blind accessibility stuff I'm going to talk about later. So I would just kind of work with an audience, I suppose. I mean, that's what I've done. Rather than trying to like seek out, I just kind of put it out there, and I've got lots of feedback. So I'm just kind of going back and forth with the community, I guess. Here's a few final accessibility options. One of the guidelines on that website is to not require people to hold buttons down. So there's a option to disable holds in the rhythm gameplay. And then similarly, there's an option called tap to speed boost, which means you can use the speed boost ability without holding down the button. I'll talk about this a little bit later, but you hold down the button and you can steer around a bit, but that option lets you speed boost without holding. There's a steering assist option, which keeps your rig in the middle of the track while you're boosting. Normally you get to steer around. There's a reduced flashing mode, which does what it says, and then there's this game is quite flashy by default, so hopefully that one will help some people. And then there's also a rhythm helper clap or controller rumble you can turn on just to hear like the rhythms in the music better. So also a few final notes. The game's UI can be controlled entirely with the mouse. There's no mouse gameplay. Yeah, I don't know if I'll get to that, but the game also starts in a window, which a lot of people don't like, but I've had cases where somebody ran the game and it ran in a full screen, but the full screen blocked them out of tools that they need, like on-screen keyboard. So that's why this game starts in a window by default. If you want full screen, you'll have to go toggle it. Okay, now we're finally talking about blind accessibility, and I want to start by talking about the user interface. So Sequence Drum is fully playable by blind people. Let's see what happens when the player first launches the game.
Done loading, press any button. Welcome to Sequence Storm, main menu. If you need narration, press the Y button while at the main menu. Click the right stick for more information. Main menu, vertical menu with 5 items, selected new game button, press the A button to activate. Click the right stick for more information.
So the game just asks the user if they want narration.
This can be changed at any time in options, vertical menu with 4 items, selected moderate button, for average players, press the A button to activate. Select game mode, this can be changed at any time in options, vertical menu with 3 items, selected audible cues button, this is the blind accessible mode, press the A button to activate. Mission selection, a grid of missions.
So yeah, it just goes through a few options and then we get to the mission screen.
Standard difficulty, selected Elijah's last 50 credits, a tutorial, not yet complete. Click the right stick for more. Story screen. Press the A button to continue through dialogues. Press the B button to skip the story.
So when the player is using narration, it adds a little bit of extra dialogue to the story as well, like this instructions on how to get through the or how to navigate the story screen.
Inside Elijah Gale's apartment building. Elijah Gale is a young computer engineer sitting at his computer terminal in his apartment. The apartment is a bit of a mess, with tools and equipment strewn around. The computer terminal is a nest of wires and cables. Outside of the small, round window, we see a dismal cityscape of identical apartment buildings. Elijah says, "Computer, connect me to Midori Raceway."
So there's just all this description of the scene is just added in whenever you're using the narration.
The terminal displays neural link activated. Connecting. Bio-authentication for user, Elijah Gale. Complete. Connected to Midori Raceway. An animated avatar appears on the screen. He is a small pink cartoon of a man wearing a racing suit and helmet. Jelly says, "Welcome to Midori Raceway. I'm Jelly, your personal concierge."
So, sorry. So the game just, at the main menu, it just asks if you want narration, just press Y. And so you press Y, and then you can play the rest of the game. So here's just an overview, fully narrated user interface, scene descriptions, and also the game has a track editor, which is also pretty much fully accessible as well. Next, let's talk about the rhythm gameplay. So I went into this having no idea how I was going to do it. My first idea was to just play cue sounds that would precede the button presses, to tell the player what to press. So I came up with 9 different distinct sounds for all the different rhythm controls. That turned out to be pretty hard to play. I mean, it would just play the sound like 1 beat ahead of when you're supposed to press the note. It kind of works. That is an optional mode in the game, but it's quite difficult. So my second try at making the rhythm game accessible was to do it in a call and response way. So the game first calls out the notes that you're supposed to press with using the audio cues, and then the player echoes that back. So a little gameplay snippet here. So what we're listening for is hearing the audio cues and then seeing the player enter those notes back. And it goes back and forth like that.
Good job. Doing great.
So that's basically how it goes. Let's see. This works really well, but I was concerned about how well this was going to scale. It turns out it actually scales really well. I have an audio clip from a player called Evangelos, and this was posted on YouTube, and he let me play it. This is one of the harder tracks in the game, played with that call and response mode.
What?
Is that
Oh my god, I actually finished the track! What?
Result success 78.82% accuracy. Press F1 for more details. Press enter to continue.
So Sequence Storm, like a lot of other rhythm games, has a very high skill ceiling. They get extremely difficult, and so I was really happy to see that this scheme for the rhythm gameplay worked really well, even at the highest levels. So I was really happy to see this. So aside from the rhythm gameplay, the other part of the game is the racing gameplay. So normally, as we saw, the player's normally on autopilot and doesn't need to steer, but the boost mechanic that I mentioned before, when you hold down the B button to boost, it lets you steer freely on the track. And this game mechanic is used in a lot of different missions where you need to like dodge or pick up something. This has been a lot more challenging to get right. There's been a lot of work to get the right kind of audio sounds to make it work. Well, it kind of works. This is still difficult for a lot of blind players. It turns out most blind people have no frame of reference for what it's like to like steer a vehicle, because they just never done it. But this video shows kind of a tutorial for the first time that the player encounters an object that they have to dodge, and I'll probably have to show you this multiple times because there's a lot to it, this short little example.
Elijah Gale says I can boost now to steer around that barrier.
Speed boost.
Bronze medal.
So we just saw the player coming across a blue barrier that was moving back and forth, and they had to use the boost ability to steer around it. So the first part of this is the panning of the sound of the barrier. If I go back to where the barrier is just in the distance, it's basically like in the middle of the screen. Like there's no, if this were panned realistically, the player would have no idea like where that barrier is on the track. So instead, objects on the track get panned as if they were like right in front of the player. So that lets the player know where that object is on the track, even if it's like right now really far away. Also, we start to hear the barrier sound with it gives us enough time to react based on the sound alone. And I'm going to play this again, and I want you to listen for the beep sound, because there's also there's a beep that
Says I can boost now to steer around that barrier.
Speed boost.
So there was a little bit of a beep sound that let us know that we're about to collide with something. And then I want to listen to this one more time for the Doppler effect of the barrier sound. That lets us know that we've successfully driven past it. So you'll hear the pitch of that sound lower.
To steer around that barrier.
Speed boost.
Bronze medal.
So you hear that the sound gets really low. So there's a lot involved with the way that objects in the world are presented. It's not just like based on physical reality. So here's just a quick overview of all that. The audible distance has been tuned. The panning design allows players to hear where things are on the track. The Doppler effect lets you know like when you've passed something. Also, the walls of the track on the left and right side make a sound, so you can hear kind of where when you're near the wall. And there's the collision warning beep. So here's a clip of a YouTuber named Flashflex Multimedia. This is a blind player. This is an infamous mission in the game called Project Avian, which is a real sticking point for blind players. But now that he's done this, nobody can complain about it, I guess. Here's him. Let's see, where does it start? Oh. I went back.
Power Max.
So there's a barrier coming up. And so he dodged a barrier and then a little patrol drone that you're supposed to avoid hitting. So I'm quite happy with how that's turned out. Some people are good at it. It is still a difficult thing for a lot of people to do. So what issues still remain? The game's not perfect. Pat on Twitter asked, if you could go back in time to when Sequence Storm just began, what advice would you give your younger self when implementing accessibility to the game? That's a good question. The number one thing that I would have done again was that a lot of the text on the screen in the game is really small. And this is one thing that I implemented really early before I even thought about it. I had a designer help me design all these different screens, and so a lot of the text on these screens is really small. It's kind of tuned to, you know, a regular player sitting, you know, right in front of their monitor. So in order to change that, it would be pretty difficult. I'd have to like redesign, re-implement, you know, this stuff. It took a lot of time and energy to get it this way, and then now I find this text, a lot of it's just too small. So that's something to watch out for. Also, this mission screen where the user selects a mission, it's like a big grid, and that's really difficult for a lot of blind people to navigate. So I would like to implement maybe a new interface for selecting missions that's just like a linear list that'll be a lot easier to navigate. A couple of remaining issues. The game still requires that, you know, at least 5 different buttons or inputs. Maybe that could be tuned. There might be people out there that would appreciate something even simpler. I don't know. And also the Microsoft SAPI narration that I've used, it's been a little bit problematic. Something about narration is that what I didn't even realize is it allows people who don't speak English to play the game because they can translate the narration. So that's interesting. There's now people playing the game all over the world because they use the narration to translate to their language. But people use a lot of different screen readers that interpret the narration different ways. So some people have, like, they're getting messages skipped and stuff. They're having to like scroll back. There's a lot of stuff for me to kind of fix there still with the narration. So what might I want to do in the future? I'm still very interested in implementing some kind of mouse-based or pointer-based gameplay, because a lot of people can only use a pointer. You know, they have to rely on, you know, moving and hovering and stuff like that. That would be interesting. That would be a big task. I don't know if anybody would be interested in that, but to me, that's a pretty. It's just like I said, it's just an interesting problem-solving thing that it would be cool to do. I'd also like to experiment with other game genres. Something I was thinking about with like open-world games. I mean, real people navigate the real world using tools like guide dogs and stuff. So imagine a virtual guide dog could be even more useful, right? You know, if you say like, who's here, and your dog can actually tell you their name. Something like that, or you say like, walk me to, or even like drive my car, you know, something like that. So I feel like there's a lot to explore to do with blind accessibility in games that nobody's just done yet. So I'd love to have an opportunity to kind of explore, you know, those kinds of things. I think it would be, again, it's just a really interesting problem. So that's it. That's everything I have to talk about. Thank you for inviting me to talk here. If you have any questions for me, I'm at @sequence_storm on Twitter. And my game is available on both Steam and itch. So that's it. Thank you so much for having me, and bye.